The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when Frances Keller decided the fence could not wait another hour, not even for the kind of storm that turned the Kansas prairie into a gray, formless sea. She had been up before dawn, before the rooster even thought to stir, pulling on her father's old canvas coat and wrapping her hands in strips of worn leather she used as makeshift gloves. The coat hung past her hips and smelled of wood smoke and linseed oil, two smells she associated so deeply with her father that wearing it still felt like a small prayer. He had been gone 2 years now, dead of a fever that swept through Harlan County in the summer of 1882, and the Keller homestead had been hers to manage alone ever since. She was 24 years old, and she had not once let the land beat her. The fence line along the eastern pasture had taken a hit from a rotted post that finally surrendered to the waterlogged ground. She had noticed it the evening before, the wire slack and curling, 3 of her 8 remaining cattle already pressing against the gap, with that infuriating bovine curiosity that made her want to scream. She had herded them back and propped the post temporarily with a forked branch, but she knew by morning the branch would have shifted and the cattle would be gone, wandering into the Henderson property or worse, out onto the road. So she was out there in the rain with a post-hole digger, a new cedar post she had hauled from the barn on her shoulder, a coil of barbed wire, and a fencing tool that had belonged to her mother. The ground was soft, which was a mercy. She worked the digger in hard, rhythmic strokes, her boots sinking into the mud with each step, her hair plastered against her neck beneath the brim of a wide hat that drooped with the weight of collected water. She did not hear the horse at first over the sound of rain striking hard earth and the occasional low complaint of the cattle watching her from a distance. She did not hear the rider slow or stop. She only became aware of a presence when the rain seemed to quiet slightly, as though the world was holding its breath, and she looked up. There was a man on a bay horse at the road's edge, not 10 feet from where she stood. He was tall in the saddle, broad through the shoulders, wearing a long oilskin duster that shed the rain in thin streams off its hem. His hat was dark with water but sat straight on his head, and beneath it was a face that was not handsome in the easy, practiced way of men who knew they were handsome. It was a working face, weathered and honest, with a jaw that looked like it had been set against difficulty more than once and had not moved. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a little past. His eyes, even from this distance, were a shade she could not immediately name, somewhere between green and gray, the color of the prairie itself in early spring. He had stopped his horse. Most men who came past on that road kept riding. Frances had learned to be grateful for that, because a woman alone on a homestead was either an object of pity or a target of unwanted attention, and she had no patience for either. She straightened, set the post-hole digger against the old fence post with a deliberateness that she hoped communicated that she was not lost, not helpless, not in need of rescue. He did not ride on. He sat there on his bay horse in the Kansas rain and looked at her for a moment, not with the slow, assessing look of a man sizing up something he might want to take, but with the quiet, unhurried look of a man deciding something. Then he swung down from the saddle in one easy motion, looped his reins around the nearest fence post without being asked, and walked toward her through the mud. "That post needs to go in at least 2 feet deeper if you want it to hold through the next storm," he said. His voice was low and even not unkind, and he spoke the way men spoke who were used to being heard the first time. Frances looked at him steadily. "I know how deep a fence post goes." He stopped a respectful distance away and tilted his head slightly. "Yes, ma'am, I imagine you do." He looked at the post she had already partially set, then at the coil of wire, then back at her. "Would you object to a second pair of hands?" "I've got nowhere to be that won't hold another hour." She studied him. She had learned to read men the way her father had taught her to read weather, watching for the small signs that told you what was really coming. This man's hands were open at his sides. He was not crowding her. He had asked, not assumed. His horse was well kept, which told her something about his character, because men who treated their animals well tended to treat other things with care as well. "You can hold the post while I work the digger," she said, "if you're going to be useful." Something crossed his face then, something that might have been amusement under other circumstances, but he simply nodded and moved to take hold of the cedar post with both hands. They worked for nearly an hour in the rain. He was strong and competent, not showy about it, not the kind of man who needed to announce his own capability. When she was ready to set the wire, he held the tension without her having to explain how, and when she reached the corner post where the wire had to be looped back, he anticipated the motion and steadied the coil before she could ask him to. It was the kind of wordless cooperation that usually took years to develop between two people, and it surprised her enough that she missed a staple and had to set it again. When the last wire was secured and she stepped back to check the line, running her eye along the fence the way her father had taught her, she noticed that her hands had stopped shaking from cold. She was not sure when that had happened. "Grant Bancroft," he said, and extended one muddy hand. She took it. His grip was firm and direct. "Frances Keller, this your land, all 40 acres of it." She said it the way she said everything about the farm, with a matter-of-factness that dared anyone to make something of it. He nodded slowly, looking out across the pasture where the cattle had finally settled, indifferent to the rain. "Good land," he said. "The creek line there will give you trouble in a wet spring. You'll want to clear the cattails back before they dam it further." She stared at him. "How do you know about my creek line?" "I can see the drainage pattern from how the grass grows," he said simply. "And the willows along that low stretch are thick enough to tell you the water sits there a while." She looked where he was looking and saw that he was exactly right. It irritated her slightly that she had not thought of it herself, and she filed the irritation away to examine later. "Where are you headed?" she asked, because it seemed the natural question, and because she found herself wanting to understand how a man like this ended up on a road in the rain. He was quiet for a moment, looking back up the road toward the north. "Dodge City," he said finally. "I've got business there." He paused. "Nothing that puts me in a hurry." She picked up the post-hole digger and the fencing tool and tucked them under her arm. The rain was easing somewhat, the sky breaking into lighter shades of gray toward the west. "I can offer you coffee," she said, and was surprised to hear herself saying it. "It's cold work, even with the coat." He looked at her again with that quiet, considering look. "That's a generous offer," he said. "It's practical," she said. "You helped me with the fence. Coffee is fair compensation." He almost smiled then. She could see it in the way the corner of his mouth moved, just barely. "I'll take the practical offer then." She walked to the barn first because the tools went away properly, and she did not cut corners on that even when she was cold and tired and thoroughly soaked. He followed without comment, and when she put the fencing tool on its proper hook and hung the coil of wire on the proper nail, she noticed him looking at the organization of the barn with the same careful attention he had given the fence line and the creek drainage. It was the look of a man who respected well-kept things. The farmhouse was small and spare but clean, with a cast-iron stove that she had kept burning low, and that now she coaxed up to a proper heat with 2 pieces of hardwood from the stack beside it. The coffee she set on quickly, and while it heated she hung her coat on the peg by the door and unwound the leather strips from her hands. Grant Bancroft stood near the stove with his hat in his hands, his dark hair damp and curling slightly at the temples. He was looking at the room with the same respectful attention he had given everything else, not prying, just seeing. His eyes moved to the photograph on the shelf above the window, a formal portrait of an older man and a younger woman who shared Frances's particular set to the jaw. "Your parents?" he asked. "My father and my mother," she said. "She passed when I was 12. He passed 2 years ago." "I'm sorry," he said, and the way he said it made her believe he meant it as something more than a courtesy. She poured 2 cups of coffee, black, and handed him one. He took it carefully, as though he understood it was offered with purpose and should be received with the same. They stood on opposite sides of the stove, and for a while neither of them spoke, which should have been uncomfortable and was not. The rain came down outside the single window over the table, streaking the glass in long, silver lines. "Where are you from?" she asked. "Originally, Missouri, then Colorado for a time." He wrapped both hands around the cup. "I've been moving around the last few years. Taking work where I find it." "What kind of work?" "Cattle drives mostly, some range management." "I worked 2 seasons for the Diamond Tea outfit up in Colorado, managed their eastern range." He paused. "Before that I had my own small spread. It didn't outlast a bad winter and a bank that had short patience." She understood that kind of loss in a way that did not require explanation. "That's hard," she said. "It was," he agreed. He did not dress it up or make it smaller than it was. "But the land's still good land, whatever name is on the deed." She looked at him over the rim of her cup. There was something in that sentence that told her a great deal about how Grant Bancroft moved through the world. He finished his coffee and set the cup on the table with care, and she thought that was going to be it, that he would put on his hat and go back to his horse and ride north to Dodge City and whatever business he had there that was apparently in no hurry. "I noticed your water pump when we came in," he said instead. "The handle's working too hard. The leather seal is probably worn through. It'll start pulling air before long and then you won't get water from it at all." She stared at him. She had been aware of the stiffness in the pump handle for 2 weeks and had been putting off dealing with it because she had not yet gotten to town for new leather. "I have a spare piece of harness leather in my saddlebag," he said. "It's a half-hour repair if you have the tools for it." She was quiet for a moment, weighing the oddness of the situation against the practical reality of a failing water pump in the middle of a wet spring. "I have the tools," she said. He was right that it was a half-hour job, though it took closer to 45 minutes because one of the pump bolts had seized and required patient persuasion with a wrench and some beef tallow from her kitchen. He worked on the pump without talking much, focused on the mechanism, and she stood nearby watching with a critical eye that she did not try to disguise, because she needed to know the repair was done correctly. When he finished and pumped the handle 3 times to test it, the water ran clean and easy, and she found herself releasing a breath she had been holding longer than she realized. "Thank you," she said. It was not a word she gave out carelessly, and she said it with the weight it deserved. He looked up at her from where he was crouching by the pump base, and this time he did smile fully, and it changed his whole face. It made him look younger and less weathered and like someone who had laughed a great deal before life got serious with him. "You're welcome, Miss Keller." She did not correct him on the miss. She was a miss, had been her whole life, had been too busy keeping the farm running to spend much time thinking about that one way or another. He left then, back to his horse, back to the road north. She stood in the yard watching him ride away, and something about the way he sat the saddle, easy and straight, tugged at something in her chest that she did not immediately know what to do with. She did not expect to see him again. Men came through that road like weather came through the county, arriving and passing, and you were a fool to count on either one staying. But 3 days later, when the rain had finally stopped and the prairie was steaming gently under a May sun, there was a knock at her door, and it was Grant Bancroft, dry this time, with his hat held correctly in front of him and a look that was somehow both certain and careful at once. "I got to Dodge City," he said. "Settled my business." He paused. "It turned out to be less than I thought it was." She looked at him. And I rode back," he said, as simply as if that explained everything, because it did explain everything, really. She stepped back from the door and let him in. Over the following 2 weeks, Grant came by the farm each day. He came in the mornings and he stayed until the work was done, which was always long past noon. There was no discussion of wages, because he never asked for any, and there was no formal arrangement, because neither of them was the kind of person who required formality to understand what they were doing. He fixed the rotted board in the barn floor. He rehung the gate on the north pasture that had been sagging since the previous autumn. He helped her move the cattle between pastures at the right time, and she noticed that he understood cattle the way good stockmen did, quietly and without drama, reading the animal's moods with the same patience he seemed to apply to everything. She worked beside him for all of it. She did not step back and let him manage things. This was her farm, her land, her responsibility, and he never once behaved as though he thought it should be otherwise. They established a rhythm in those 2 weeks that felt startling in how natural it was, how little explaining it required. At noon she fed them both, simple food because she was a practical cook, not a fancy one. Beans and cornbread. Salt pork and potatoes. Once, on a Friday, she made a dried apple pie because she had the apples and the time, and when he ate 2 slices with the focused appreciation of a man who has spent too many months eating trail food, she felt a warmth move through her that she was beginning to recognize. They talked over these meals with a gradual, deepening ease. She learned that he was 31 years old, that he had one younger sister in Missouri, named Clara, who had married a schoolteacher, that he had worked cattle since he was 16, that he had lost his spread to a combination of the brutal winter of 1880 and a bank in Denver that foreclosed 6 months faster than it had any legal right to, but that he had been too broke and too far from a lawyer to contest it. He spoke about that loss without bitterness, just the flat acknowledgement of a man who had been dealt a bad hand and had kept playing. She told him about her father, about learning to farm from him when she was small, following him through the furrows in her bare feet. She told him about the 2 difficult years since his death, how she had nearly lost the farm herself the first winter, how she had survived it through stubbornness and the assistance of her neighbor Ruth Henderson, who was 60 years old and had survived enough on the Kansas plains to know that stubbornness was sometimes the only thing standing between a person and disaster. Ruth Henderson, Grant said. The widow woman on the next property east. Frances looked up from her plate. You know her. By reputation only. She's well regarded in the county. Frances smiled, which she did not do very often, and when she did it was noticeable. She is the most competent woman I have ever met in my life, she said. She was farming that property alone for 10 years after her husband died, and she never once asked anyone for anything she didn't need. Grant was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Seems like a quality that runs in the neighborhood. She looked at him steadily, and he looked back at her with those green-gray eyes, and neither of them said anything for a moment that stretched a little longer than a regular moment. She looked down at her plate. The south field needs to be broken for summer planting, she said. I noticed, he said. The soil's dried out enough now after the rain. You want to start it tomorrow. Yes, she said. And that was how they left it, because neither of them was quite ready yet for anything more. But things were shifting between them, moving like water under ice in late winter, slow and invisible until suddenly it was not invisible at all. She began to notice small things. The way he watched her when he thought she was not paying attention, with a careful attentiveness that was not a stare but a sustained noticing. The way he made sure his horse was always tied where it would not tear up the kitchen garden. The way he had begun, without discussion, to bring small things when he came. A coil of good wire he had bartered for in town. A glass jar of molasses she had mentioned she was low on. Once, impossibly, a brown paper packet of pepper seeds because she had mentioned in passing that she had wanted to grow peppers and had not gotten seeds ordered in time. She did not know what to do with the pepper seeds. She stood in the kitchen holding the small brown packet and felt something move in her chest that was large and inconvenient and entirely unwelcome in the practical architecture of her daily life. She planted the seeds. It was Ruth Henderson who finally said the thing that Frances was not yet saying to herself. Ruth came over on a Thursday morning in the 3rd week of May, driving her small wagon with the easy authority of a woman who had been handling horses longer than most men in the county had been alive. She took her coffee at Frances's table and looked at the tools arranged differently in the yard, at the rehung gate visible from the window, at the fresh boards in the barn floor visible through the open door. You've had help, Ruth said, in the tone of a woman who already knows the answer. A man stopped to help with the fence, Frances said. He's been assisting with some repairs." Ruth's eyes were sharp and dark and missed nothing. "What kind of a man?" "A cattle man. From Missouri originally. He's passing through to Dodge City." Ruth looked at her for a moment with the patience of someone who had outlasted many young women's stubborn economies with the truth. "Frances," she said. "He went to Dodge City and came back." Frances was quiet. "That's not passing through," Ruth said. Frances wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Outside, Grant was working on breaking the south field with the plow, and the sound of the iron cutting through the earth came in through the open window at steady intervals, as reliable as a heartbeat. "I know," Frances said softly. Ruth nodded once, satisfied. "Well," she said, "good." It was on a Saturday evening in early June that everything shifted from the careful, practical, companionable thing it had been into something else. They had finished a long day of fence mending on the north pasture, proper mending this time with new posts and good tight wire, not an emergency repair in the rain. Frances had made supper, and it was a real supper because she had a laying hen that had cooperated, and she had made eggs and salt pork and fried cornbread, and there was real butter on the table because the Hendersons' cow had produced well, and Ruth had sent some over. After supper, neither of them moved from the table right away. The evening was warm and the door was open, and the sky outside was doing the thing the Kansas sky did in early summer, going through colors that had no names, orange and rose and a deep wounded purple at the horizon, the kind of sky that made you feel the vastness of things and simultaneously made you want to be less alone in the face of it. "I need to tell you something," Grant said. He was looking at his hands on the table, which was unusual. He was generally a man who looked at you directly. Frances waited. "I rode back from Dodge City because I couldn't stop thinking about you," he said. He looked up then, meeting her eyes. "I know that's a plain way to say it. I don't have a more elegant version." She held his gaze. Her heart was doing something complicated and physical that she was trying not to show. "I prefer plain," she said. "I've been trying to make myself useful," he said, "because I didn't want to just say it outright without earning the right to say it, and I don't know if I've earned it yet. But I think if I wait much longer I'm going to be plastering your barn walls and reshingling your roof and digging a new well, and eventually you're going to ask me why, and I'd rather just tell you now." He paused. "I think you're the finest woman I've ever known, and I'd like to keep knowing you if that's agreeable to you." The evening light was coming through the door and laying across the table and across his face, and Frances Keller looked at Grant Bancroft in the golden light and understood that she had been waiting for this moment with more urgency than she had admitted to herself, that she had been waking up each morning with something that was neither anxiety nor expectation but some mixture of both, and that the mixture was because of him. "It's agreeable to me," she said. He breathed out slowly. Then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his, carefully, the way he did everything, and she turned her hand over and held his back. They sat like that for a while as the Kansas sky finished its extravagant sunset and settled into the blue dark of a June evening, and the cattle moved slowly in the north pasture, and somewhere down the creek line, a nighthawk called once and fell silent. What followed was the most quietly beautiful month Frances had ever lived through. June on the Kansas prairie was not always gentle, but this June was. Warm days with enough rain to keep the soil dark and the grass thick, and Grant was there for all of it. He had written to a boarding house in town and taken a room there, which was proper, and he paid for it out of money he had made in Dodge City doing 2 weeks of range work for an outfit passing through, money he had not originally told her about because she had not asked, and he had not wanted to make it complicated. She found out because Ruth Henderson told her, having heard it from the boarding house keeper. Frances thought about that for a while. He had taken a room and was paying for it honestly so that he could be near her without imposing. It was the most considerate thing anyone had ever done in her vicinity, and it made the complicated feeling in her chest more complicated still. He came to the farm every day, and now that the work was somewhat caught up, there was time for things that were not work. They walked the property in the evenings after supper, following the creek line that he had correctly identified as a drainage problem, talking about what could be done with it, what crop rotation she was planning for the fall, what the cattle would need through the summer. But the conversations moved off the practical too, more and more. He told her about Colorado, about the mountains he had seen in the western part of the territory, the way the snow sat in the passes even in August. She told him about the one time she had been east, all the way to Kansas City with her father when she was 15, and how the crowds and the noise had thrilled and frightened her in equal measure. "Would you go back?" he asked. "If you could." To Kansas City, she thought about it. "No, this is where I belong." She looked out at the flat, enormous prairie, the way the grass moved in the evening wind like the surface of a slow green sea. "I know that seems small to some people. 40 acres in Harlan County, Kansas. But it's mine and I know every inch of it and I can't think of a thing I'd rather be." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It doesn't seem small at all." There was a night, 3 weeks into June, when a lightning storm came up fast from the southwest, the way the worst Kansas storms did, arriving before you had time to think about them properly. Frances had been outside checking that the barn doors were secured when the first lightning split the sky directly overhead, and the crack of it was so enormous and immediate that she stumbled backward against the barn wall, not exactly frightened but startled out of her competence for a single second. Grant was across the yard in an instant, coming from where he had been checking the well cover, and his hand was on her arm before she had fully gathered herself back. "All right?" he asked, close enough that she could hear him over the wind. "Fine," she said, just startled. His hand was still on her arm, and they were close together against the barn wall as the rain began to come down hard and the lightning went again, illuminating everything in that cold white clarity that made the world look like a photograph. In the white light she could see his face clearly, the concern on it, and something else beneath the concern that was not concern at all. She kissed him. She did not think about it first, which was unusual for Frances Keller, who thought about most things first. She just did it, turning toward him in the dark between the lightning flashes and pressing her mouth against his, and he responded immediately and completely, one hand coming up to the side of her face with that same careful, purposeful manner he brought to everything, and they stood together against the barn wall in the Kansas thunderstorm, and kissed with all the accumulated weight of everything that had been building between them since a rainy afternoon and a broken fence post. When they broke apart, the rain was coming down in sheets, and the lightning was going regularly, and Frances was breathing harder than the weather accounted for. "I've been wanting to do that since approximately the third day I knew you," Grant said. She laughed. She did not laugh very often either, and when she did it was full and real and took her whole face with it. He looked at her as though he had just seen something extraordinary. "Inside," she said, "before we both drown." June became July, and with July came the hard work of high summer, the endless cycle of water and weeding and checking the cattle for the flies and diseases that came with the heat. Grant threw himself into all of it with the same steady competence, and there was a new ease between them now that the kissing had settled something, a relaxation of the careful formality that had sat between them in the early weeks. He still came from the boarding house each day and left in the evenings, because propriety mattered in a small county, and Frances had a reputation for seriousness and self-sufficiency that she was not prepared to compromise for anyone. But he stayed later now, until the sun was fully down, and they sat on the porch together in the warm dark with whatever was cold to drink, which was usually water from the pump he had repaired, and they talked about everything. About the future. Carefully at first, the way you approach something you want to be sure of before you trust your whole weight to it. It was on a night in mid-July that he said, quietly, looking out at the dark field, "I've been thinking about what I want for the next part of my life." She waited. She had gotten very good at waiting for him to arrive at things because he never wasted words, and what he said was always worth the wait. "I want land," he said, "not just to work someone else's land. My own. I had a taste of that before it went wrong, and I've spent the time since working for other men thinking about it." He paused. "There's a piece of ground north of here about 3 miles up the road, 120 acres. I looked at it last week. It's been abandoned for 2 seasons, but the soil is good and the water table is close enough for a good well." She turned to look at him. His profile in the dark was still and deliberate. "That's a significant investment," she said carefully. "I've been saving since Colorado," he said. "I have enough for the down payment with something left for the first season's needs." He turned to look at her then. "I want to be near here, that's what I'm saying." "Why?" she asked, because she needed to hear him say it plainly. "Because you're here," he said. "Because this is where I want to be." He held her gaze. "I'm not saying it to put pressure on you. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. I just want you to know that when I talk about what I want next, you are in the center of it, Frances. Not the edge, the center." The night was very warm and the stars were out in their full Kansas abundance, which was extravagant, and the crickets were loud in the grass. And Frances Keller understood that she was at a turning in her life the way you understand when you're standing at a fork in a road. Not because there's a sign, but because the ground itself feels different under your feet. "Grant," she said. "Yes." "Buy the land," she said. He bought the land. He went to the county seat in late July and came back with a deed in his name and a quiet satisfaction on his face that she recognized as the satisfaction of a man reclaiming something he had thought permanently lost to him. They walked the property together on the first Sunday in August, the two of them moving through the tall grass of the abandoned fields, Grant describing what he planned to do with each section, and Frances offering observations about the soil and the drainage that he listened to with complete attention and incorporated immediately into his thinking. It was a good piece of land. She could see that clearly. The previous owner had not worked it well, had not understood the drainage properly, had put crops in places that would never hold against a dry summer, but the land underneath the mismanagement was sound. With proper work and proper planning, it could be excellent. "You'll need to build a house," she said, standing in the middle of what had been an overgrown kitchen garden. "I'll start on that in September," he said. "Something small first, something solid. I can add to it later." She looked at him, and he looked at her, standing in the August heat in the middle of his new land. And the later hung in the air between them with a weight and a shape that both of them could feel. August was dry and hard. The work on both properties was constant. Grant began breaking his north fields, and Frances managed her cattle through the heat with the grim efficiency of a woman who understood exactly what the stakes were. She lost one calf to something in the water, a bad stretch of creek that had gone stagnant in the dry spell, and she spent a dark evening sitting on the porch after it happened, not crying but close to it, the frustration and the grief and the tiredness of doing everything alone for 2 years pressing down on her harder than usual. Grant found her there. He had come late that evening, later than usual, having stayed to finish setting a fence post on his own property, and he read her face immediately when he walked up. He sat down beside her on the bench without saying anything, close enough that his shoulder was against hers, and left it there. She let herself lean into him just slightly, just enough to feel the steadiness of him. "I lost the Patterson calf," she said. "I heard," he said. "Ruth Henderson came by my place this afternoon with the news." "I should have moved the cattle off that creek stretch 2 days ago," she said. "I saw the signs." "You had 5 other things happening at the same time," he said. "You can't see everything." "On my own land, I should be able to see everything." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Frances, you have been managing this farm alone for 2 years. You have not lost the farm. You have not lost your cattle. You have not lost your mind, which under the circumstances strikes me as the most impressive of the 3. He paused. "Losing one calf in a bad summer on a stagnant creek is not a failure, it's farming." She breathed in and out slowly. "I know that. I know you know that," he said. "I'm just reminding you." She was quiet for a long moment, and the night moved around them, the warm, dark air, the stars, the distant sound of cattle settling. Then she said, "I'm glad you came back from Dodge City." His shoulder pressed more firmly against hers. "So am I," he said. "Every single day." In September, Grant started building the house on his property. He had hired 2 men from town to help with the framing, and Frances came over on Saturdays to watch the progress and sometimes to help where she could, holding boards while they were nailed and handing up tools from below when the men were on the roof. The house went up faster than she had expected. A solid 2-room structure with a proper stone foundation and a fireplace on the north wall, small but soundly built. The way everything Grant did was soundly built. She brought him food on those Saturdays. Bread she had baked that morning, hard cheese, dried beef. She told herself it was practical, the same practical logic that had offered him coffee in the rain, and it was practical, but it was also something else, and she knew it. On the last Saturday of September, when the house was roofed and sided and the door was hung, Grant walked her through it. The 2 hired men had gone for the day and they were alone, their footsteps loud on the new board floor, the smell of fresh-cut wood and stone dust in the cool September air. "It's good work," she said, touching the window frame where the joining was tight and clean. "I want it to last," he said. She turned from the window. He was standing in the middle of the main room, and the afternoon light came through the new window glass and made the space feel larger than it was. "Grant," she said. "Frances," he said. And then they were both quiet, because the moment had arrived at something that had been approaching for a long time, and they both knew it, and neither of them was going to pretend otherwise. He crossed the room to her in 3 steps and took her hands in both of his. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to marry you, and I want us to figure out together what to do with 40 acres and 120 acres side by side, because I think we could make something extraordinary out of it. And I want to do everything else beside you, the hard parts and the good parts, for the rest of whatever time we've got." He stopped. "I am asking plainly, because that is how I know to ask. Frances Keller, will you marry me?" She looked at him for a long moment, at his honest, working face and his green-gray eyes, and the way he held her hands with exactly the right amount of pressure, firm and careful and absolutely sure. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He closed his eyes briefly, the way a man does when something he has been holding his breath against finally resolves in the right direction. Then he opened them again and smiled at her, the full smile, the one that changed his face, and she thought she could stand looking at that smile for the rest of her life and not get tired of it. He kissed her there in the new house in the September light, and she kissed him back, and it was different from the kissing in the thunderstorm, less startled and urgent and more like a promise, which was exactly what it was. They were married in November, in the small white church in Harlan that Frances had attended her whole life, on a bright cold day when the prairie grass had gone to its winter gold, and the sky was that particular hard blue that Kansas produced in November as if to compensate for all the months of gray. Ruth Henderson was there, sitting in the front pew with an expression of dignified satisfaction, wearing her good black dress and a hat with a small feather. The boarding house keeper was there, and 2 of the men from town who had helped build Grant's house, and a few of the neighboring farm families who had known Frances all her life. Frances wore her mother's dress, which had required some careful work with a needle and thread because her mother had been smaller through the shoulders, but which she had managed. It was ivory cotton with small blue flowers embroidered along the collar, and when she stood at the altar in it, Grant looked at her with an expression that made her grateful she was not a woman who was given to crying easily, because she was very close to it. The Reverend was a young man named Pryor who had come to Harlan only the year before, and who was still slightly nervous in front of congregations, but who did a proper and moving job of it. Grant spoke his vows clearly and without hesitation, looking at Frances the entire time with those steady eyes. She spoke hers back the same way, because she had never in her life said something she did not mean, and she meant every word of it with the full weight of who she was. Afterward, Ruth Henderson held her hands and said, "Your mother would have been pleased," which undid Frances more than anything else that day, and she had to look at the ceiling of the church for a moment before she was all right again. Grant's hand found hers, as it did now with a naturalness that had settled over them both, and she held on. They had both properties to manage, and the question of how to handle that had occupied them in the weeks before the wedding, with the kind of practical focus that both of them were comfortable in. They would live in Grant's house, which was slightly larger and had the benefit of the stone foundation and the good fireplace, and they would work both properties. Frances's land would remain in her name. This was not a point she had needed to argue because Grant had offered it himself. Understanding without being told that the land her father had broken and her mother had worked, and that she had held alone through 2 years of difficulty, was hers in a way that went beyond the legal. He would work his land and she would manage both, and they would figure out together what to grow and what to graze and where. The first winter of their marriage was the kind of winter that tested things. November was mild, but December came in hard, with a blizzard that kept them inside for 3 days and coated everything in a foot of snow and ice that the January sun only partially addressed. They were warm enough, because Grant had laid in an excellent supply of firewood with the foresight of a man who had survived a bad Colorado winter and intended never to be caught short again. They were fed well enough because Frances had spent October doing the kind of autumn preservation work that her father had taught her, the crocks of salt pork, the jars of canned beans and tomatoes, the root vegetables in the cellar. They were, in fact, very content. It surprised Frances in the quiet way that large things often surprise you, not all at once but in increments. She had been good at being alone. She had made it work, had built routines and systems that allowed her to function efficiently without leaning on anyone. But being alone, it turned out, had never been what she wanted. She had simply never been given a good alternative. Grant was present in a way she had not expected, and not just physically present. He paid attention. He remembered things she said in passing. He noticed when she was tired or troubled and adjusted accordingly, not by fussing over her, which she would have hated, but by being quiet when she needed quiet and by talking when she needed talk. He was a man of considerable inner life, she discovered, with opinions about things that surprised her and a curiosity about the world that had survived intact despite everything the world had done to complicate his life. They argued sometimes because both of them were strong-willed and accustomed to their own judgment. In March, there was a genuine disagreement about which section of his north field to plant in corn and which in wheat, and they went back and forth about it over 3 evenings with enough heat that Ruth Henderson, who happened to call on the second day, raised an eyebrow and then left quickly with an amused look. Grant planted the corn where he had planned to, and Frances planted the wheat where she had insisted on. By August, both sections were performing well, and Grant said with great dignity, "It appears we were both right," and Frances said with equal dignity, "It appears so," and they left it at that. She became pregnant in the spring. She suspected it in April and was certain by May. She told Grant on a Sunday morning, sitting at the breakfast table, with the same directness she brought to every important thing. He was very still for a moment. Then he looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something enormous and very carefully held. "Are you well?" he asked. "I'm perfectly well," she said. "I'm a little sick in the mornings, but that seems to be how it goes. Ruth says it should ease by the 2nd month." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Frances," he said. "Don't make a fuss," she said gently. "I'm all right, we're all right." "I know you're all right," he said. "I'm just—" He paused, and she saw him searching for the word. "Grateful," he said at last. She turned her hand over and laced her fingers with his. "So am I," she said. The summer of their first full year together was the best summer Frances had ever had on that land. The crops were good. The cattle were healthy. Grant had put in a kitchen garden beside the house that by July was producing more than they could eat, and she had spent whole August afternoons preserving and canning, with a satisfaction that was different from the grim, productive satisfaction of the previous years. Because this year, it was not just survival she was working toward. She kept working through her pregnancy, because she was Frances Keller, and that was simply who she was. And Grant did not ask her to slow down or behave as though she were fragile, which would have driven her to madness. He simply adjusted what he asked of her on any given day with a subtlety that she appreciated, making sure the harder physical work fell to him without it needing to be discussed. And she let him because it made sense, and because it was offered with love rather than pity. Ruth Henderson came by regularly, checking on her with a practical thoroughness that Frances found more comforting than any amount of gentle hovering. Ruth had delivered 3 of her own children on that farm and had midwifed for neighbors all across the county in the years since. Frances had already asked her, straightforwardly, to attend the birth, and Ruth had accepted with an equal straightforwardness that had steadied something in Frances considerably. In the heat of July, a thing happened that disrupted the peace of their summer and reminded them both that they were living in a time and a place that was not always kind. A group of men, 4 of them, came riding through the county claiming to represent a land agency out of Topeka. They were the kind of men Frances recognized immediately as trouble, not outlaws exactly, but men who operated in the spaces where the law was still being figured out, using legal language to do things that were not quite legal, or that were legal on the surface of them and deeply wrong underneath. They had apparently pressured 2 families west of Henderson's land into signing papers that significantly undercut the value of their land, claiming debt obligations that were disputed. Frances heard about this first from Ruth Henderson, who heard it from the circuit preacher who had come through. One of these men came to Frances's fence line late on a Tuesday afternoon, just the one, a broad man in a town suit that was wrong for the heat, and said he needed to speak with the owner about a matter of property assessment. "I am the owner," Frances said. He blinked at her. It was a blink she was familiar with, the adjustment required when a man expecting one thing encountered another thing entirely. "I need to speak with Mr. Keller," he said. "There is no Mr. Keller," she said. "My name is Frances Keller, and this is my land and my deed, and if you have business with this property, you will speak with me." Grant appeared at the barn door at that moment, having heard the voice, and he walked across the yard unhurriedly and stood beside Frances. The man looked at Grant with the unmistakable relief of a man who has found the person he was actually looking for, and Grant said, quietly, "My wife has already told you who you speak with on this property." The man looked between them. He had papers that he wanted to discuss, he said, a matter of the county assessment record and certain liens that might apply. "Let me see the papers," Frances said. He hesitated. She held out her hand. She read the papers with the careful attention of a woman who had been managing her own legal affairs for 2 years, and who had sat with a lawyer in Kansas City with her father long enough to understand the shape of a fraudulent document. The papers were a confused document, using real legal language to imply obligations that did not actually exist in them. "These papers don't say what you're implying they say," she told him. "The assessment here is for a property 3 miles east of this one, different deed number, different acreage. And the lien reference cites a Kansas statute that was repealed in 1879. She handed the papers back to him. "I suggest you try this somewhere else. And I would suggest that if you continue trying it in this county, there are enough people here who can read to make your position very uncomfortable." The man took his papers and left, and he did not come back. Grant looked at her afterward with an expression that was partly admiration and partly something that was simply pride, the uncomplicated pride of a man whose respect for his wife has just been confirmed and enlarged. "Where did you learn about the 1879 statute?" he asked. "I made that up," she said, but he didn't know that, and she went inside to start supper. They found out later that the man and his associates had indeed been pressuring families in the county into signing documents, and that 2 families had signed away significant portions of their value under misrepresentation. The county sheriff, a man named Oakes who was honest if slow-moving, eventually ran the group out of the county with the help of enough formal complaints, one of which Frances wrote herself, carefully and in full detail, that they did not return. It was a reminder, unpleasant but useful, that the prairie was not simply a place of weather and work, that there were human designs operating on it that required vigilance. Frances had always known this. It was simply useful to have it confirmed, and to have had the opportunity to confront it directly. November came again, a year since the wedding. Grant marked the occasion by making her a small gift, a box he had made himself from the leftover cedar wood from the original fence post, the very first thing they had worked on together, though he had not told her that. He had jointed it carefully and fitted it with a small brass hinge from the hardware in town. Inside it he had placed a folded piece of paper on which he had written in his careful, clear hand a list. She unfolded the paper and read it. The list said, the fence, the coffee, the water pump, the pepper seeds, the thunderstorm. 68 days of south field work, the first night on the porch, August and the calf, the new house, her name. Yes, she sat for a long time looking at the list, at the whole year of them written out in his plain handwriting. I didn't want to forget any of it, he said. She folded the paper back into the cedar box and held it in both hands. Neither do I, she said. The baby came on a cold morning in late November, almost exactly a year to the week after their wedding, arriving with the decisive efficiency of someone who had made up their mind. Ruth Henderson was there, calm and capable, and Grant was outside the bedroom door because that was where Ruth had firmly placed him, where he stayed without protest, but also without going any further away. It was a boy. Frances heard him before she had finished understanding what had happened, that first extraordinary sound, and the exhaustion of the long morning fell away from her entirely. Ruth placed him in her arms, and he was red-faced and furious and absolutely real, and Frances Keller looked at her son and felt something rearrange itself permanently inside her. Grant came in when Ruth opened the door. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at them, and the expression on his face was the one she had been unable to name the morning she told him she was pregnant, the enormous, carefully held thing, and now she could see it clearly. It was love, very large, with no edges on it. "Come here," she said. He crossed the room and sat beside her on the edge of the bed, and she tilted the baby toward him, and he looked down at his son with that expression for a long time without speaking. "Thomas," he said finally. It was a name they had discussed but not fully decided, and she heard the question in it. "Thomas," she agreed. Grant reached out one careful hand and touched the side of the baby's head with his fingertips, gently, the way he touched things he wanted to last, and the baby turned his face toward the warmth. "Hello," Grant said very quietly. "We've been waiting for you." Thomas Bancroft grew through the winter with a thoroughness that impressed even Ruth Henderson, who said she had seen more new babies than she could count, and this one had a particular look of getting on with things. He was a solid and serious infant, which Frances found exactly right, watching the world with dark eyes that she suspected would settle to green-gray. The winter of that year was easier than the previous one, not in terms of the weather, which was fierce in January and February, but in terms of everything else, because the house was warm and full, and the work that had always felt relentless to Frances on her own now had a different quality to it, the quality of something being built rather than merely maintained. In the spring, when Thomas was old enough to be brought outside in the afternoon warmth, Frances sat with him on the porch while Grant worked the south field, and she looked out at the land, her land, the 40 acres her father had broken and her mother had loved, and that she had held through difficulty and loneliness, and then across the fence line to Grant's 120 acres, where the winter wheat was already coming in green and even. And she felt the full scope of what they had made together settle over her like a hand on the shoulder, the particular weight of something solid. Spring moved into summer, and Thomas found his voice and then his feet, lurching between things with the focused determination of a child who has decided walking is simply a matter of commitment. Frances laughed more than she had in years, genuine surprised laughter that came out of her at unexpected moments. At the things Thomas did, at the things Grant said, at the sheer improbability of the life she was now living when compared to the life she had been living when she was out there in the rain with a post-hole digger, and no particular reason to expect anything to change. The harvest that year was the best since Frances had taken over the farm. The corn came in full. The wheat on Grant's north field was excellent, and he sold a portion of it in Dodge City at a price that covered a portion of his land debt and left them with something over for improvements. Frances expanded her cattle to 12 head, replacing the 2 she had lost and adding 2 more, and the pasture management that she and Grant had worked out together, rotating the animals between her eastern pastures and his unused western section, was proving out. Ruth Henderson came to dinner on a Sunday in late September, and Frances made a proper dinner, roasted pork from a hog they had butchered, with potatoes from the kitchen garden and green beans from the last of the summer's preserving jars, and Ruth ate with the appreciative silence of a woman who respected good food. Thomas sat at the table in the high chair Grant had made for him from the same cedar wood as the box, and performed the complex work of eating mashed potato with a seriousness that made the adults around him almost unable to look at each other for fear of laughing. Ruth watched Grant refill Thomas's bowl and Thomas apply himself to it and said quietly to Frances, "Your mother would have been so very pleased." Frances looked at Ruth across the table, and then at Grant, who was watching Thomas with the easy contentment of a man whose life has arrived at exactly where it was supposed to be, and she thought of her father's canvas coat hanging on its peg in the barn where she still kept it, and her mother's dress folded in the cedar chest, and the photograph on the shelf of 2 people who had built something in this hard and beautiful country and had passed it to her. Yes, she said, she would have. That second autumn settled gently, the way the best Kansas autumns did, with long golden afternoons and cold, clear nights, and a sense of things completing themselves correctly. Grant's house, their house now, had been added to that summer, a 3rd room built on the east side with proper jointed walls and a window that looked out toward the creek line where the willows were thick and the light fell gold and long in the late afternoons. Frances had put a rocking chair in that room and a rag rug she had made over the winter, and it was where she sat in the evenings with Thomas when the day was done. Grant often came and leaned in the doorway while she was sitting there, the way he did, just watching, just being present without requirement. "What are you thinking about?" he asked her on one of those evenings when the autumn light was doing its best work and Thomas had fallen asleep against her shoulder with the total finality of a sleeping child. She considered the question honestly, which was the only way she knew to consider anything. "I'm thinking about the fence," she said. He raised an eyebrow slightly. "In the rain," she said, "that morning, I was so angry at that fence. I'd been awake since before dawn and I was soaked through, and that post had been going bad for a month and I'd been putting it off because I had 6 other things to do." She looked down at Thomas's sleeping face. "I was thinking that if it hadn't been going bad right then on that particular morning, you would have ridden past." Grant was quiet for a moment. "I might have stopped anyway," he said. "Maybe," she said, "but probably not." He came into the room then, crossing to her, and sat on the edge of the bed nearby so they were at a level. "Then I'm grateful for bad fence posts," he said. She looked at him and smiled, the full smile, the one that didn't come out often but that came out for him. "So am I." He reached over and touched her face, that same careful gesture, thumb along the line of her jaw, and she leaned into it slightly. And Thomas shifted in his sleep, making a small sound. And outside the window the autumn light was doing that thing it did, going golden and long and enormous across the prairie, laying itself over everything, the 2 properties, the fence line they had mended together, the creek he had read from the shape of the grass, the fields where the harvest was in and the ground was resting, the road that ran north toward Dodge City, and from which, on a rainy morning in May, a man on a bay horse had stopped and looked at a woman in the rain and made a decision. The winter that followed was long but manageable. By now they had systems and stores and a house warm enough to be genuinely comfortable, and Thomas moved through his first winter with the cheerful obliviousness of a 16-month-old who does not yet understand that weather is something to worry about. Grant taught himself the fiddle that winter badly, with a determination that made Frances put her head down on the table on more than one occasion, though she would not for anything have asked him to stop. By February, he could play 2 songs recognizably, which Thomas found endlessly entertaining, stomping his small feet on the board floor with a look of profound musical satisfaction. Spring came again, the way it always did, with a sudden shock of green and the return of the meadowlarks. Frances found out in March that she was pregnant again, which she had been half expecting, and she told Grant the same way she had told him the first time, directly at the breakfast table. He looked at her across the table with the same expression she was learning to read more fluently, the enormous careful held thing, and then he looked at Thomas, who was engaged in the serious business of examining a wooden spoon, and then back at her. "Are you well?" he asked. "Perfectly well," she said. "Though if you play the fiddle between the hours of 8 and noon for the next 2 months, I cannot be responsible for what I do to that instrument." He laughed, a real laugh, and it was still one of her favorite sounds in the world. The pregnancy moved through spring and into summer with the same orderly efficiency as the first, Frances working and managing, and not allowing herself to be treated as though she were made of something fragile. Grant was steadfast and present, and at this point, practiced in the particular art of supporting Frances Keller, without suggesting in any way that she needed supporting, which was both a subtle art and one he had become genuinely good at. Summer brought a new neighbor to the property 2 miles south, a family named Garrity, husband and wife and 3 children, who had come from Ohio with more hope than experience. Frances called on them within their first week, bringing bread and beans and a genuine directness about the realities of farming in Harlan County that the wife, a young woman named Mabel, received with visible relief. Mabel had been frightened. Frances could see it clearly, not the temporary fright of new arrival but the deeper, creeping fright of wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. Frances remembered that feeling, or something close to it, from her own worst winter. She spent 2 afternoons that summer with Mabel Garrity, sharing what she knew about the land and the water and the ways to get through a Kansas winter with a family intact. She did not do it out of sentiment. She did it because it was the right thing to do, because Ruth Henderson had done it for her when she needed it, and because the land was hard enough without the people on it working against each other. Grant helped the Garrity man, whose name was Charles, with his well, which had been poorly sited by the previous survey. They re-drilled it in August, Grant and Charles working together with the same wordless practical competence that Grant brought to everything, and when the water came up clean and cold from the new hole, Charles Garrity shook Grant's hand with the grip of a man whose anxiety has just resolved into something workable. "You've got good neighbors here," Charles told him. Grant looked across the road toward the 2 properties that were theirs. "The best," he said. The baby came in October, also a boy, arriving faster and with less ceremony than Thomas had, as though he had decided there was no point in making a production of it. Ruth Henderson delivered him in under 3 hours and pronounced him perfect with the authority of someone who had made the assessment a great many times. They named him Daniel, after Frances's father, Daniel Arthur Bancroft, and when Frances said the name in full for the first time, she felt the rightness of it settle through her completely. Thomas, now almost 2, regarded his brother from a careful distance and then, apparently deciding that the situation was acceptable, brought over a wooden block and placed it beside him, which was his way of offering welcome. That October, with 2 small sons and 2 adjacent properties and the harvest coming in, Frances stood in the kitchen one afternoon while the boys slept and looked out the window at the long afternoon light on the prairie, the creek where the cattails were properly cleared now, the fence lines running true, the fields that had given well in their third year together, and she thought, "We built this. We came at it from different directions, this man and I, carrying our separate losses and our separate competencies, and we met at a broken fence post in the rain, and we built this. It was not a small life." She had always known it was not a small life, had known it with an insistence that bordered on defiance, but she knew it differently now, more fully, the way you know a thing when you are standing inside it rather than defending it from outside. Grant came in from the barn stamping mud off his boots, which she had told him any number of times to do at the door and not inside it, and she turned from the window and said, "You're tracking mud again." And he said, "I know, I'm sorry," and his eyes were warm when he said it, warm in the way they had been since a day in May 2 years ago when he had looked at a woman in the rain and made a decision he had never regretted for a single hour. She crossed the kitchen and handed him the cup of coffee that was still warm on the stove because she had made it 20 minutes ago when she heard his step on the porch, and he took it and wrapped both hands around it as he always did and looked at her over the rim. "The North Wheat Field," he said. "I want to talk to you about the rotation for next year." "Beans first, then corn," she said. "The soil's worked hard enough in wheat." He nodded slowly. "That's what I was thinking." He paused. "You always think the same thing I'm thinking." "Not always," she said. "I thought the west section should go in wheat last year and you thought corn, and you were right about that." "You were right about the beans," he said. "I was right about the beans," she agreed. He smiled at her. It was November in 2 weeks, 2 years since the wedding, and she thought he was more beautiful to her now than he had been then, which was something she had not expected about love, the way it deepened rather than normalized, the way familiarity made things more visible rather than less. "Grant," she said. "Frances," he said. "I love you," she said. She did not say it constantly, because that was not her nature, and so when she said it, it landed with the full weight of being meant. He set the coffee cup on the table and stepped toward her and took her face in both his hands, gentle and sure. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since a woman in the rain told me she knew how deep a fence post goes." She laughed, and he kissed her, and outside the window the prairie was doing its November work, going golden and cold and wide, the sky enormous overhead, the land running out in every direction to the horizon, and somewhere down the road Ruth Henderson was feeding her chickens, and the Garrity family was building their first real life in Kansas soil. And in 2 small rooms Thomas and Daniel Bancroft were sleeping through the afternoon. And the fence lines ran true, and the fields were resting, and the house was warm, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole of everything. On the morning of their second wedding anniversary, Grant got up early, and Frances heard him moving quietly in the kitchen, trying not to wake her. She lay still for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of him, the scrape of the stove door, the pop of kindling taking, the particular rhythm of his boots on the board floor, and she felt the warmth of it move through her the way it did every morning, that small daily understanding that this was real, that she had built this, that the man making coffee in her kitchen was hers and she was his. She got up and went to the kitchen doorway and stood there watching him. He had his back to her, working at the stove, and the early morning light came in through the kitchen window and laid itself across the back of his oilskin coat that he'd already pulled on, the coat that had replaced the one he'd been wearing the day she met him. He turned and saw her. "Happy anniversary," he said. "Happy anniversary," she said. He held out a cup of coffee, already poured, already the right temperature because he had been making her coffee for 2 years and he knew exactly how long it needed. She crossed the kitchen and took the cup and leaned up and kissed him once firmly, a good morning kiss that was also a 2-year anniversary kiss, and also just the ordinary beautiful fact of them. Daniel made a sound from the back room, the tentative sound of a baby waking up and assessing whether it was worth making a fuss about. Thomas's feet hit the floor a moment later, decisive as always. Frances and Grant looked at each other over the rims of their coffee cups, and the morning came through the windows gold and cold, and the day opened up in front of them like good land in good light, every inch of it known and loved and worth the work. Thomas appeared in the doorway in his nightshirt, dragging his blanket, with the serious expression of a 2-year-old who has important things to accomplish. "Papa," he said. "Good morning," Grant said, and reached down and picked him up easily, settling him on his hip, and Thomas regarded the morning with satisfaction. Frances watched them and felt the fullness of it press against the inside of her chest. That relentless human fullness that she had learned in the last 2 years had nothing to do with the absence of hardship and everything to do with the presence of love. From the back room, Daniel's tentative sounds were becoming more committed. "I'll get him," she said. She set her coffee cup on the table and went to get her son. And behind her, she could hear Grant starting to tell Thomas something about the south field, something about the planting they'd do in spring, laying it all out for the 2-year-old as though he were a partner in it, which he was, in the long way of things, the way all of them were partners in this piece of ground, and this life they were making on it. She lifted Daniel from his bed and he looked at her with his new morning face, still pink and soft with sleep, and she held him against her chest and stood at the window of the room Grant had built on the east side, the one with the rocking chair and the rag rug, and looked out at the property in the early morning light. The fence lines ran true. The creek was clear. The fields were winter quiet, resting and gathering themselves for the spring. The road ran north through the frost-silvered grass toward a horizon that was broad and open, and full of weather and difficulty and astonishing light. She thought of a morning 2.5 years ago, standing in the rain with a post-hole digger, cold and tired and entirely alone, watching a stranger stop his horse at the fence line and not ride on. She thought of a man with green-gray eyes and open hands, and a quiet way of asking instead of assuming. She thought of coffee and pepper seeds and a box made of cedar, and a list written in careful handwriting that she kept in the drawer of the washstand and looked at sometimes when she needed to remember. She held her son and looked out at the land and listened to the voices of her husband and her oldest boy in the next room, and the warmth of the stove reached all the way to the east room, and the morning light was coming in gold and certain, the way it did on a good November day in Kansas, and the whole of their life together lay spread out before her like good ground, already proven, still growing. Frances Keller Bancroft breathed in the morning and smiled.